Words from Paul's letter to the congregation in Rome, the 8th chapter. We are well aware that the whole creation until this time has been groaning as in labor pains. And not only that, we too are groaning inside ourselves, waiting with eagerness for the redemption of our bodies. In hope we already have salvation. In hope, not visibly present, or we should not be hoping. Nobody goes on hoping for something he cannot see. But having this hope which we cannot yet see, we are able to wait with confidence and endurance. One of the more unusual stories to emerge out of the darkness of Buchenwald, that infamous work camp of World War II, is about a group of physicians who were also prisoners, who followed the same crushing routines as the others. They arose at 4 a.m. in the morning, stood and shivered through the roll calls, worked at the day-long drudgery of the plants, finally received a cold bowl of thin soup at the end of the day. Like all the rest, they were starved, beaten, overworked, with no reason to expect any other fate than the miserable death that they saw around them every day. But at night, when the other prisoners went to sleep, these weary doctors took to staying up a while, huddling together secretly, talking. They would discuss cases together. They would prepare and present papers to each other. They would make plans to try and improve the health conditions in the camp. They began actually to smuggle materials to build an X-ray machine, which they badly needed. Every piece had to be stolen, concealed in their clothes. Guards had to be bribed. Became quite an obsession with them to succeed in this task, slowly with the help of other prisoners, engineers and electricians, before they ended up in the camp. They got the thing done, and they used it to diagnose and treat fellow prisoners. You know, one could say how crazy, how futile, but by acting out their hopes and dreams in this regard, they were not only able to help others, but they kept themselves alive. And we know, because some of them did in fact survive, to tell the story of how their hope kept them going through all those awful days. First Sunday in Advent, right in the midst of, at least weather-wise, the most hopeless time of the year, I guess, Christians celebrate the importance and reality of it. Isn't it strange where you often do find it? Right in the middle of thoroughly discouraging circumstances where there seems so little to look forward to, there it is, the presence of life-giving hope. On the other hand, often in the midst of relative comfort and security, we encounter no small measures of despair, often about tomorrow, discouragement with life. So hope does, if you stop and think about it, seem to be a quality of person quite independent of externals, a spirit which has little to do with our abilities, our good fortune, our comfortable surroundings. All the clinical studies are quite clear. Hope does make the critical difference between health and disease, life and death. I like the way Andrew Greeley has put it. The hopeful person is the one who survives because he believes in survival. He lives because he believes in life, period. The hopeful person only dies once. He lives strong and vitally right up to the point of death. It's the capacity, after digesting the blows, grieving the losses, the capacity to turn and look forward again, to believe in tomorrow, that saves us, keeps us going. For we have been saved through hope, writes the old apostle so long ago. In an interview, the late Dr. Carl Menninger, one of the founders of the famed Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, said this: "Hope is the basic ingredient of life." Still, not much has been said or written about it. St. Paul knew how important it was. He put it right up there alongside faith and love. But if you look in the Encyclopedia Britannica, for example, you'll find pages and pages about faith, columns about love, but hope, poor little old Hope, she's not mentioned once. He talked about the importance of hope in teaching. If you ever hear a teacher say that a student is hopeless, you've got a hopeless teacher on your hands. Of its role in medicine. I trust we're seeing the last of hopeless doctors telling patients their case is hopeless. Once we saw a feeble-minded child recover in the clinic. Medically, her case was supposed to be hopeless, but she recovered anyway. So hope was there all the time. We just did not see. So in hope we are saved, Paul writes to his friends in Rome. How do we come by it? How do we keep it? Certainly, it begins with the willingness to embrace a kind of faith, not faith in creeds or doctrines, but faith in what? The future. Who hopes for what he sees, asks the apostle. Here, I think, is where hope is a deeper, more profound reality than mere optimism. I have nothing against optimism. The more, the merrier. But it does seem that when we talk about optimism, we're really talking about a selective way of seeing the glass half full rather than half empty, we say. Someone said they encountered the ultimate in an optimistic classified want ad. For sale, 1926 Stutz Bearcat. Takeover payments. Occurred to me later, the most optimistic thing about the ad may be the assumption that people know what a Stutz Bearcat is in this day and age. So optimism usually means the tendency to pay attention to the good and the promising about our lives, and that's not bad. But hope is deeper. Hope, says the old story over and over again, hope is in God. And what does that mean? That means hope is confidence in that which we cannot yet see. Hope is the confidence that no matter how the picture happens to be at the moment, no matter if the glass is half full or bone dry, this neither predicts nor determines what tomorrow will be. Tomorrow is open. It's ultimately in the hands not of economic forces or political power or some crazy's decision. Hope is in the hands of a reality that we can neither anticipate nor manipulate, whose purposes we believe are ultimately good. Toward the end of the 15th century, all of Europe was caught up in a chill of despair and hopelessness. There was such dismay, people actually believed the world was shortly coming to an end. In the year 1492, a German author and publisher produced a volume called The Nuremberg Chronicles, rather famous in its day. Story of gloom and doom, sold well, telling the reader of calamities that had befallen the human family and that were impending. And with a climax of dejection, the author invites the readers to use the final blank pages to record the further catastrophes that would occur before the not too distant end of the world. Of course, as you probably have picked up, the very year the book was published, there sailed into the harbor of Lisbon a battered little sailing ship that had returned through the storms of the Atlantic, and at the wheel was a man whose story was too amazing to be true. He spoke not of the end of the world, but of a new world of endless possibility. And here we are. Around New Year's, you will read all sorts of stories about predictions that the wise have made, economists, politicians, preachers. Great Henry Adams, for example, said in 1903, "My figures all coincide in fixing 1950 as the year when the world will end in ruins." President Jimmy Carter said in 1978, "Because of the greatness of the Shah, Iran will always be an island of stability in the Middle East." And Business Week prophesied in 1979, with over 50 foreign automobiles already on sale in this country, the Japanese auto industry isn't likely to carve out a significant slice of our market. So much for attempts to see the future. Haven't we learned over the last decade or so this lesson? Arthur Schlesinger Jr. reminded us a few years ago, if any pundit or commentator had predicted in 1985 that within 8 years Germany would be one nation, communism would be discredited, the Soviet Union would be dissolved, Eastern Europe would be free, he would have been written off by everyone as mad. One might add that 7 new nations would join NATO right up to the borders of the old Soviet Union. The Lord brings the plans of the nations to nothing. A dictator is not saved by a great army, nor a warrior by great strength. A man cannot trust his armored personnel carrier to save him. but the eyes of the Lord are turned toward those who fear him, towards those who hope. Hope is the conviction, deep-seated, that something good is going on in history that we cannot see or anticipate or engineer, but to which we can trust ourselves. And as in history, no less than our own story, the dismal circumstances of this morning, the sad turn of events yesterday, the economic reversal we could not anticipate, they do not decide our lives. That's what it means to hope in God. Hope toward tomorrow precisely because we do not see. And this is precisely what it means to hope in Jesus and his story. His cross speaks of what was apparent to everybody, the futility and despair of any kind of decent life in this kind of world. His resurrection speaks of what could not be seen by the skeptical and cynical, a future that God was creating out of that death, that disaster, a future of love and peace. Dr. Martin Seligman, in his new volume, Authentic Happiness, tells of what he refers to as the most remarkable undergraduate he's ever been privileged to teach. Her name is Sheen Sethi Iyengar. Totally blind, she crisscrossed the United States in her senior year at the University of Pennsylvania while doing her senior thesis. She visited congregation after congregation, measuring the relationship between religious faith and hope for the future. To do this, she gave questionnaires to hundreds of adherents. She recorded and analyzed dozens of weekend sermons. Sounds more like punishment than thesis to me, but scrutinized the liturgy and the stories told to children in the church schools of 11 prominent American religious traditions. Her first finding, interestingly, was that the more conservative and traditional the religion, the more optimistic are its adherents. The most liberal forms of Judaism and the Unitarians are more depressed on average. Sorry about that if some of you come from those traditions. But she also discovered that the increase in optimism, which was brought by faith, is entirely accounted for by hope in God. She quotes the words she heard in her journey, the words of the Christian mystic Julia of Norwich, who sang from the depth of the Black Plague in the 14th century, "But all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. God has not said, thou shalt not be tempested, thou shalt not be travailed, thou shalt not be diseased, but God has said, thou shalt not be overcome." But this faith in the future does require some moves on our part. To give hope form and staying power in our lives does require that we shape visions of what we hope for, visions so real that we can reach out and touch them, live for them. I like the little second grader in a parochial school. Her teacher said, one day as part of religion class, I asked the children to draw a picture of what they'd do if they could spend a whole day with Jesus. Well, the pupils tackled the project eagerly. After a few minutes, this one little girl bounced up to my desk with her almost finished drawing in hand. "Miss Lopresti," she said, "how do you spell Neiman Marcus?" At least she knew where she wanted to go. Thornton Wilder, the great playwright, once said, "Hope is a project of the imagination, and so is despair. Despair all too readily embraces the ills that it foresees. Hope is an energy and arouses the mind to explore imaginatively every possibility to combat those ills. In response to hope, the imagination is aroused to picture every possible issue, to try every possible door, to fit together even the most difficult pieces in the puzzle. After the solution has been found, it's even difficult to recall how you got there. And the dream need never run out. Journalist Neil Morgan loved to tell the story of his father, a Baptist minister, preacher, who died at the age of 100. He says his father always had a future that he lived toward. In his early career, he was conscious to the community. He was always writing letters to the editor, calling for change toward what he dreamed his town could be. In later years, he was a constant visitor to the sick and shut-in who he felt needed more hope toward their future. At age 97, he mailed a cheery postcard by the thousands to persons he felt needed a lift, and they were all signed S.L. Morgan, 97 and a half. In his last month before his 100th birthday, he didn't write any longer or speak very much, but in these last years, he'd always had a dream, and the dream was of making it to 100. His son writes, when the big day came, the family gathered, and with us came droves of his friends, and we all gathered around the bedside, and I leaned down close to his ear, and I shouted, "You are 100 years old today." "Say it again," he said in a hoarse whisper. And then he laughed because he'd won his last fight, the way he won them all, with a deep faith in his God, toward the future he wanted, he hoped for. At a funeral later that month, one old friend sought to explain what force it was that sustained my father. He spoke of believing that no matter the scope of one's influence, one must live with hope and then leave the rest to God. I realized as the casket disappeared that I was clutching my father's final letter to me. He had written, "Son, I think it may be as good to be a reporter who preaches a little as a preacher who reports a little. Either way, we met life head on with hope, didn't we?" To meet life head on with hope. Haven't you known friends who were able to keep going because they still had a hope, a dream, however modest, however tempered by the years, because they had something to look forward to? And you have your dream this morning, don't you? Hope is faith in the unseen, reinforced by our dreams. And then finally, and also, hope has to be acted upon. We have to put feet to it. Hope in God is sustained as we act hopeful, as we make some moves toward the future of which we dream. Louis Medis writes, "We fear and hope at the same time." Have you ever noticed? Fear lurks behind hope the way the dark side of the moon lurks behind its shining face, and hope answers fear the way the sun answers the darkness of night. For example, an ordinary visit to the doctor is a little parable of fear and hope. Fear says what? Don't go. You may get some bad news. Hope says, go. He may be able to help you. A city dweller writes, she's a waitress in a large western city, and my wife and I have befriended her. We eat where she works, and if she isn't our waitress, we always ask for her, and she comes by our table to chat for a minute or so. For a while, I thought we struck up a friendship with her because we felt sorry for her. She's one of the most homely gals you'd ever want to meet. Her nose is a bit too large and misshapen. Her eyes protrude. Her hair is all wrong for her. Acne's left her face scarred and pockmarketed. She's something of a cruel genetic joke in a way, and apart from being physically shortchanged, she has a minimal amount of charisma. I thought as my wife hugged her last time we were in the restaurant that that's probably the only hug she gets. She lives alone, 2,500 miles from home, and is obviously lonely. One has to wonder, observing her lot in life, listening to her reveal snatches from her rather bleak existence, just how such a gal can have hope. What does this physically unattractive, lonely girl have to hope for? How can hope possibly reside in her when it seems life has given her so little upon which to build hope? But the amazing thing to us is she has it. Is this really why we are so drawn to her and inspired by her? She speaks so easily of her faith that God has a plan for her. She chatters away about her activities. She runs in marathons and asks us to come and watch her. She looks for a better job, hopes for a new apartment. In short, out of the silence of her blemished and uncomely face, out of the silence of her lack of personality, out of the silence of her companionless life, out of the silence of her menial job, out of all this silence that would seem to speak of nothing but despair, there is yet a quiet little sprig of hope, very much alive, very much growing, very much going. So having this hope for what we cannot see, we go on hoping. We wait with confidence and endurance, and in our hope, we are already saved. Amen.